I want to pick up a comment from the comment section under the YouTube videos. Now, I know I've done a lot of videos recently about the VAT on private education, and this person says, "Thank you for raising this. The independent school parent community owe you much gratitude for trying to educate people on this stunning ignorance in the comments. I've noticed commenters seem to be very right wing for some reason. Perhaps it would be better if they go and actually read some of the reports and studies first on the topic before making sweeping, prejudice, vile, unintelligent comments. Then they may realise that they will be worse off with this policy. See Adam Smith report for one. While independent schools are exempt from VAT on tuition fees and educational activities, they pay VAT on many goods and services used for non-core educational purposes. Their charitable status offers some relief, but they still face substantial VAT liabilities for operational and non-educational activities. Just over half are in fact charities. The others operate with tiny margins and reinvest. Payments for education and boarding services are typically exempt from VAT under current rules. However, the Labour government outlined plans to introduce 20% VAT from across the UK from January the 1st, 2025, and that's what I've been dealing with. And so I'm really grateful for these comments when they come in, whether these are supportive or negative, because it gives me an opportunity to go to the text and then double check. And so I've read the report on the Adam Smith Institute by a person called, if I can find the name, Maxwell Marlowe, Director of Research and Education at the Adam Smith Institute. And he's authored a number of reports on the proposed VAT for private school fees policy. And I think that they're interesting reports. So looking at this contentious issue, this measure that has polarized public opinion, even if that's not reflected in the comments under my videos, which seem to be universally telling me that I'm wrong and that I'm pursuing a non-popular opinion. I don't mind pursuing an opinion that isn't popular, because I think it's important to look for things which are inconsistent and which perhaps don't command popularity at the moment. I think something, we have to look at political issues and legal issues and ask whether or not they are grounded in moral certainty. And I don't think this is. Or do they have unforeseen consequences? And I think this definitely does. While the government argues that this policy will deliver much needed revenue to the public purse, the evidence as presented by the Adam Smith Institute and others suggests otherwise. So it's worth looking to see why this policy is as flawed as it is ambitious and, frankly, spiteful. The government predicts a net gain of 1.3 to 1.5 billion pounds annually. Yet the Adam Smith Institute analysis shows that the migration of pupils from private to state schools and the closure of some schools could transform this projected windfall into a fiscal deficit. For every 15 to 25% of private school pupils transferring to state education, the cost to the taxpayer rises exponentially. With state schools spending an average of £11,600 per pupil annually, this influx could cost the government an additional £1.6 billion, obliterating any revenue gains altogether. Moreover, the precedent from countries like Greece, where a similar tax was repealed after creating general mayhem, serves as a cautionary tale. Without subsidies or exceptions, this policy risks financial failure, much like its ill-fated predecessors. And what I find so extraordinary is that the present government didn't bother to look at what happened in Greece. Independent schools operate on tight margins, with over half functioning as charities, and many reinvest their modest surpluses into scholarships, SEND provision, and infrastructure. And those people in the comments who say, well, the schools around Oxford, the private schools around Oxford that I've seen don't provide for SEND. And have you been in those schools? Because almost all the independent schools, almost all the private schools that I have seen have extensive SEND provision. And certainly the schools that I've taught in sometimes not only is there SEND provision, but there are additional supporting staff who come into the classrooms with some of the SEND pupils. I've had 3 support teachers coming into the classrooms that I've been teaching in a single classroom, which is extraordinary. I don't think I've ever come across that in a state school, and I don't think I've ever come across that in an international school, a school abroad. And it's particularly significant in the smaller schools, which are catering to smaller communities. VAT disproportionately affects small to medium-sized schools, especially those serving the middle-income families in regions like Greater Manchester. And these schools lacked the financial resilience of larger institutions that could, and therefore they could face closure, displacing thousands of pupils. But for those schools which don't face closure, parents may well be acting with some immediacy because of the size of the bills that they're now facing. For parents, the average fee increase of over £3,000 annually pushes private education beyond their reach. And this would particularly impact families who've sacrificed other luxuries for their children's education. The government's failure to consider such socio-economic nuances exposes the policy's inadequacy and aggression, and the speed with which it's been implemented adds further burden to that issue, and is a further rebuke to the government and to the Treasury for not doing its homework. State schools are already grappling with overcrowding, teacher shortages and funding gaps. The migration of pupils from private schools will exacerbate these issues, diluting resources and teacher attention. And the Adam Smith Institute points out that this would harm not only the incoming pupils, but also those already in state education, reducing overall educational quality. Education is not merely a service, it's a cornerstone of the progress of society, and by taxing private education, the government undermines parental freedom to choose the best for their children. This policy disregards the principle that education, whether private or not, whether private or public, is a public good. And independent schools contribute to innovation, academic excellence, and specialised SEND support, which benefits society at large. If you go back through history, it's the private education which becomes the blueprint for education across the country. And the policy relies heavily on the IFS report, which the Adam Smith Institute criticises for being outdated, for using outdated data and flawed assumptions. For instance, the elasticity of demand for private education is assumed, not evidenced, leaving policymakers with unreliable projections. Ignoring these criticisms risks economic and educational chaos. And that's where we get these extraordinary statements that faith schools will not be forced to close, and yet one does, immediately. The same sort of issue dominates the Treasury's failure to prepare for the inheritance tax on farmers, and the bold statements that the farm closures will affect only a very small number of farms. Again, the evidence is that the Treasury has not done its homework. If it didn't do its homework in one subject, it's not going to do it in another. In other words, the Treasury is lazy. The VAT policy could spark a domino effect as private schools reduce spending to offset VAT. Payroll taxes, NICs and supply chain contributions will fall, and this contraction will ripple through local economies, undermining public finances further. Additionally, high fees could drive talent away, with skilled professionals reconsidering the UK as a viable place to raise families. This policy is a glaring example of short-term thinking masquerading as fiscal prudence. It risks destabilising a delicate ecosystem of private and public education while yielding negligible, if any, financial benefits. As Adam Smith himself observed, prudence is of all virtues that which is most useful to the individual. It's high time policy makers applied this virtue to public policy. I think there is still time to urge the government to reconsider this this measure, and to look carefully at the Greek example, which was targeting particularly private schools, which were complementing and doing a lot of the work that the public schools, that the state schools simply were not achieving. These private schools, which were run after school most days of the week, and many students attended them. I used to teach in quite a number of them. They were called frontisteria, from frontizo, to help. But they were far from perfect, and in many ways, the helping out was helping the people who set up and took the money for these schools. But in principle, the idea was to provide the necessary academic support that students were not getting in the state system. And when I visited state schools in Greece, I was appalled particularly by the English language facilities and the English language training. And I remember going to one state school in Piraeus on invitation, by invitation. And by that point, I was the author of quite a number of English as a foreign language teaching books, and so I was a recognised authority. And I was invited in, and it was a bit of a jolly, really. But what I found was the English teacher hid in a cupboard, as if she was going to Narnia, and because she was worried. I learned afterwards that her English wasn't fluent enough, and so I was shown around the school by the person who taught religion. And oddly, although that teacher could speak English very well, we spoke in Greek, and I found, and we became friends, which is how I discovered that the English teacher was hiding in a cupboard. And that is the problem. People in the Greek state system often got their jobs through paying bribes, and once they got their jobs, it was very difficult for them to be sacked. And they weren't paid a great deal, which is why many of them moonlighted in the frontisteria in the evenings, teaching what they should have been teaching during the day. They were exhausted. They were exhausted. I've seen teachers fall asleep at their desks. And we're not in that position yet in the UK, but we are in a position where a lot of parents turn to private tutors to supplement the teaching which is not being given in the state schools, and in some cases in the private schools, and it's and that on top of the fact that if they can, they move to better catchment areas so that they're at a better state school. I think the whole idea of Ofsted putting out a league table of which schools are good and which schools are not good is extraordinarily foolish, because that in itself encourages this huge movement of people from one area to another to get to a better catchment area. If state school education is good, which it should be, then there should be no difference between one state school and another. But there is. And until we can be sure that all state schools exhibit a good educational standard and good educational systems and good teaching and good results, then I think parents have every right either to homeschool or to find private means to ensure their children are given the support that their children need. And parents know what their children need long before the state or the education system can work it out. It takes too long to set up a child with the necessary bureaucratic documentation to give them SEND support. And if that can be available through a private system, then we should be taking advantage of that. The better way forward for managing private education is to ensure, number one, that private facilities are as available as possible to state school pupils, and number two, that the state schools become so good that we don't need private education. But to get rid of private education, to penalise private education for doing the job well, is an absurdity. You don't do something better by getting rid of something which is doing the job well. You don't bring everybody else up to standard by penalising those who are getting the top marks. That isn't the way forward.